Good morning, and thank you for coming today. Before I kick this off, I would just like to say thank you to the Naval War College Foundation and especially the Van Buren Foundation for their generous support of this conference. I'm very, very excited about what I see on the agenda, and I'm sure that it will be very, very interesting and lively discussions. Thanks for coming. The topic of professional ethics is intended to be a thread that runs throughout our curriculum here at the Naval War College. There are ethical aspects of almost every topic we discuss here, and it is a hope and expectation that those aspects be discussed as appropriate throughout the year. Still, it's desirable to focus specifically on ethical questions in focused events as well. This conference is the major opportunity in this academic year. As you look at the program, you can see that we will be discussing a wide variety of topics. Indeed, at first glance, it may not be obvious to you that they are ethical topics. Often, when we think about ethics, we think somewhat narrowly in terms of personal behavioral issues, such as telling the truth to power, Uniform Code of Military Justice violations, joint ethics regulations, gifts, things like that. Of course, all those are important, and failures in those areas are indeed serious. But as you rise in rank, ethical issues, like everything else, get to be more complex. It's no longer simply a question of your personal behavior. You're members and increasingly leaders of a profession of arms. As such, you are entrusted by your nation with a profound responsibility of national defense. You're expected to be loyal and obedient even when you may personally disagree with policies and leaders above you. You are bound by an oath to the Constitution of the United States, or whatever the equivalent may be for the international officers here among us today. And for our speakers, we have officers from over 50 countries here at the Naval War College. You're responsible for the evaluation, promotion, discipline, and retention of fellow professionals. All of these aspects of your professional life generate a unique set of ethical obligations that emerge from your status as a professional and set you apart from fellow citizens. Over the next 3 days, we'll have an opportunity to explore and discuss a number of facets of those obligations. We'll begin with a deep look at the role of the military in American life and the concerns our founders had with standing militaries. We will examine some recent controversies in which tension between senior military leaders and civilian authorities have become matters of national controversy. We will examine the role of culture and religion, both within our military forces and as operational challenges as we operate in regions where our understanding of both may be poor. And we will consider the intellectual ethical component that requires us to strive to understand and adapt so as to be mission capable as possible in the face of such challenges. The President indicated he intends to allow gay people to serve openly in our armed forces, a position some officers may have opposed. Assuming this policy change is made, you and your generation will be the leaders charged to implement that effectively. We'll have an opportunity to discuss that challenge. In short, the next 3 days promises to raise many important issues for your consideration. You'll have ample time in your seminars to discuss these questions, and our goal in this conference is the same as the overall goal of a war college education: to prepare you to be the best and most effective senior leaders you can be. And now, to introduce the themes of the conference, Dr. Martin Cook, our Stockdale Professor of Military Ethics, will further frame the issues of the conference. Thank you.
I want to begin by talking a little about the concept of professional ethics that the Admiral referred to. I think it's important to distinguish that from personal ethics, as he indicated, in a number of ways. In particular, the concept of professional ethics draws our attention to the fact that military professionals have a special role, special duties, special attributes, and special obligations that flow from the fact that they have that role. First of all, they bear a responsibility for a vital need for the society, in this case, the defense and security of the nation. Historically in the West, there were only 3 true professions: clergy, medicine, and law, distinguished from all others because of the uniquely special character of the responsibility of those professions. Society grants to true professions a high degree of autonomy to discipline and promote their own, to train their own, to prepare their own next generation. They have a unique body of knowledge which is their responsibility both to pass on to new members and to continually expand and develop so as to meet as best as possible their unique responsibilities to their societies. And most importantly, they have a unique ethic grounded in their special role. It gives their members special permissions to do things that ordinary citizens may not, but it also places them under unique restraints that ordinary citizens do not experience. Therefore, professional military ethics is much broader than questions of personal ethics. As the Admiral indicated, this conference will address a number of topics which may not at first glance appear to be ethical issues. So it's important to frame this conversation to help you see how they are indeed ethical questions. Our first couple of speakers today will begin with a discussion of the deep historical roots of the role of the military in U.S. culture, and in particular, the particular issues that frame the U.S. Constitution. Remind ourselves of our early history. Our founders experienced the oppression of a standing army in the form of the British, who forcibly quartered their own troops in American homes and whom they eventually had to engage in combat. They looked at Europe and observed a pattern of perpetual war among European powers and were determined to find a way to be free from that pattern. They were good historians. They studied the history of earlier democratic republics and concluded that standing armies had almost always been the death of them. So the point here, and Jim Burk will talk about this in much greater depth, is the pattern that we have all experienced in our lifetimes of the U.S. having large standing military forces is an artifact of the Cold War. It's, in fact, a variance with that deep historical tradition, which Jim will talk about quite a bit. So we've been living in a phase that our founders would have viewed as anomalous and potentially quite dangerous. So Jim will help us see how, when the Cold War forced that upon us, the thinkers of that period tried to reassure the American public that this would be fine. But it does raise deep questions if our founders were not totally mistaken about the potential dangers here. So we need to explore those questions. In particular, it's vital that every military member understand the special obligation that the fears of the founders place upon them. That will be the theme, in fact, of this entire day. Mary Beth will talk about it, and Aaron will talk about the specific issue of gays in the military. But I wanted to stress that the issue is not about gays in the military for its own sake. The issue is an example, perhaps a heated example in the minds of some, of a general problem, which is that military officers do not make policy. They're charged to carry out the policies of their elected leaders. Tomorrow, we'll take up topics of the importance of understanding different cultures and of the religious role of the regions where our forces deploy, and also managing the balance between personal religious expression on the part of our own officers and your status as members of a constitutionally governed federal service. How are these ethical issues? Well, first of all, professional ethics, as the Admiral indicated, has an intellectual component. Our ethical responsibility, is to continually expand our knowledge in ways that ensure that we are as prepared as possible to execute missions effectively. Fairly clearly, failure to understand cultures and to ensure that our actions are as culturally sensitive as possible to the people of the places where we deploy and with the coalition partners with whom we serve has in fact severely compromised our effectiveness on a number of occasions. And it is an area where historically Americans tend to be quite weak as a culture. Few of us really speak another language, for starters. We often deploy in very large numbers and immediately recreate little Americas in theater, which prevent close interaction and learning from the local population. As Jeff Charlotte's article painfully illustrates, the one that you had in the read-ahead, Jesus Killed Muhammad, some of us go beyond mere failure to understand and engage in actively pushing our own religion and culture in ways that may be deeply offensive and even dangerous to the environments where we deploy. So Mr. Charlotte and Dr. Otis will give us rich perspectives on this whole range of cultural and religious questions. Furthermore, we have seen numerous instances of truly egregious and unconstitutional pushing of personal religious agendas within our own forces. I came here from the United States Air Force Academy just this June, and you may have noticed in the paper there were a few challenges along these lines during my time at the Air Force Academy. A lot of that, I think, was complicated on the part of some officers of good intention by a lack of a good legal and historical understanding regarding the relationship of church and state in the U.S. tradition. Some religious conservatives in our culture go so far as pushing a completely bogus alternative version of American history, according to which the U.S. was originally a Christian nation and who call for a return to that imagined past. According to them, separation of church and state is a recent innovation of a liberal Supreme Court. Such ideas are, of course, completely false, but they are widespread in some quarters in our society. For those of us who are bound by an oath to the Constitution, therefore, it is vitally important that we understand what the constitutional issues really are and conduct our conduct to as accurate an understanding of the legal ground truth of these as possible. Major Latondra, Air Force JAG, and her colleague Dave Fitzke have written the definitive law review article on all of these questions, and she will be here tomorrow to provide us legal ground truth on the scope and limits of personal religious expression within the military. This is an ethical question because the meaning of one's oath to the Constitution of the United States generates an obligation to clearly understand what that Constitution means. And under our system, the meaning of the Constitution is definitively settled by the rulings of our courts. Ultimately, at least since Marbury versus Madison in 1802, by our Supreme Court. Thursday, we will revisit the ethics of civil-military relations by looking at recent controversial behavior on the part of some very senior active duty and retired officers. Just consider the following points. Retired officers have now become routine stage props at political conventions, and their endorsement is highly sought by political candidates. Recently, 6 retired officers publicly called for the resignation of SecDef Rumsfeld and criticized his handling of the war in Iraq and handling of the Defense Department. Reaching back a little farther, Colin Powell, when chairman of the Joint Chiefs, published an op-ed in the New York Times criticizing the policy on gay service members the newly elected President Clinton had advocated during his campaign. General Odierno, working with retired former Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, General Keane, and civilian scholars at the American Enterprise Institute, reworked the Iraq strategy recently, completely outside the chain of command, sold it to the President, bypassing entirely the Chairman and the Joint Chiefs. Richard Cohn, the former Chief Historian of the Air Force and eminent scholar of civil-military relations, has for years argued forcefully that senior military officers are seriously insubordinate and fundamentally fail to understand their proper role regarding policymaking. You have Dick's most recent piece on that subject as your other read-ahead for today. That piece, by the way, got direct attention from CNO, and our president, Admiral Weisskopf, was charged by CNO to write a formal response to it. So that's the level of visibility that got. We will conclude on the last day with a debate on all of these questions among 4 scholars on civil-military relations, all of whom you will have heard from at some point during the conference, Mary Beth Ulrich, Jim Burk, Dick Cohn, and myself. So you will have an opportunity in your seminars this afternoon and on Thursday to discuss all of this. Our hope is that the topics will be rich enough to provide you at each an opportunity to process the information, articulate your views, gain insight from your peers, and from your facilitators. So I promise I hope to be a very rich 3 days for all of us. Without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker. Our first presentation this morning is Professional Military Ethics in the American Tradition by Dr. James Burk. After earning his PhD from the University of Chicago, I wore the tie, Professor Burk embarked upon a distinguished academic career teaching at Texas A&M University and has published widely in the field of military sociology. He is the author of 3 books and has also served as the editor of the journal Armed Forces and Society and was consulting editor for the American Journal of Sociology. His articles have appeared in numerous publications. He has spent his professional life studying social theory and civil-military relations. It's a pleasure to welcome him to our conference. Jim.
Thank you, Admiral. Dr. Cook, thank you for inviting me to be with you today. I'm so happy to have a chance to talk about this very important issue, and happier still to have the promise of 3 full days in front of us so that we can talk about these issues together. Let me get right to work. The end of the Second World War was the cause of many important turning points in the lives of its participants and in the lives of their heirs. Some turning points posed problems so novel that we hardly knew how to think about them. Consider the new need after 1945 to worry about nuclear weapons. Such worry was unimaginable to all but a very few before the Second World War began. Now it is, of course, a frightful commonplace. Other turning points challenged institutional arrangements that were simply taken for granted before World War II began. An obvious example is the post-war collapse of the vast European empires. Less than 50 years before, these empires were sturdy markers of the centuries-long rise of the West. Now, of course, they're gone. Today I want to talk with you about a third turning point. A turning point when old institutions no longer work and the problems that they were meant to solve have to be solved anew. What I have in mind is the overthrow of long familiar practices adopted by the United States to maintain the government's ability to wage war effectively against foreign powers, and yet do so without disturbing the rights and liberties of our citizens. We will soon see what these practices were. For now, it's enough to notice what these practices were for. They were meant to solve a problem. They were meant to answer a question. That is, how should we balance a republic's demand to be militarily secure and yet remain free? This sounds so familiar to you, you may not even hear me when I say it. But listen to what I'm saying. To balance the demands for military security with the demands of the rights and liberties of our citizens. Alexander Hamilton had this question in mind when he asked how the new American Republic could attain what he called a happy mean between power on the one hand and privilege on the other. By power, he meant the energy of government. By privilege, he meant the claims that citizens have against the government, the claims for their own rights and liberties. What is the happy mean, Hamilton asked, between power, the energy of government, and privilege, the rights and liberties of citizens? The question he raised was difficult. The founders of the Republic never agreed. They never agreed among themselves about whether there was an answer. Yet they had to do something. This issue was impossible to ignore. So they stitched together a solution. The solution was based on compromise more than principle. It was to create a system that might work. No guarantees. It might work even though it lacked the warrant of consensus and was not backed by an elegant theory. Their pragmatic solution was simple. It was to raise an army as large as needed to fight wars when wars occurred, and then, when war was over, to demobilize that army as far and as fast as possible before it had a chance to get established. This is oversimplified, of course, yet it's true enough. From the end of the American Revolution to the first months after the end of the Second World War, this practice worked well. By the late 1940s, it worked not at all. and everyone knew it. Here's a turning point, the turning point for today. The alliance that had won the Second World War was comprised of countries seriously divided by interests and ideology, divided over how to arrange the peace. The result was neither war nor peace. Instead, we had a Cold War, mobilizing the power of the United States and its Western bloc to deter the presumptively aggressive power of the Soviet Union and its Eastern bloc. This novel circumstance made it impossible for the United States to do what it had done previously, to demobilize the military completely after winning the war. Instead, the country had to create a powerful, permanent military establishment to meet the Soviet threat. And there was no precedent for doing so. For the first time since debate about ratifying the Constitution, the country was forced to think seriously about balancing military power against the rights of citizens, about maintaining an effective military to meet a powerful foe while sustaining the democratic values on which the country was based. How was this to be done? The question drew the attention of social scientists, among them Samuel Huntington and Morris Janowitz, no strangers to you. Of course, I'm referring to Huntington's work, The Soldier in the State, and Janowitz's work, The Professional Soldier. Both of these are landmark contributions to our understanding of civil-military relations, and they make major contributions to the debate I want to talk about today. Different though their two contributions are, it is nonetheless fair to say that when they were confronted with the problem that we've just described about threats to liberty from a standing army in peacetime, they both thought the problems could be solved by strengthening the professional military ethic. Why both thought so is a matter that we'll have to examine closely. Notice this was not what the founders believed. When we study the founders' arguments, which we will also do, when we study the founders' arguments about dealing with standing armies in peacetime, we find that they put little or no weight on the role of virtue. The founders were happy when virtue was found, well, sure. Still, to prevent the abuse of power and protect the liberty of citizens, they placed greater confidence in the operation of institutional checks than in adherence to norms. So we've identified really three topics that we want to talk about now, three questions which we'd like to answer if we could. One is, why did Huntington and Janowitz think strengthening the military's professional ethic was the way to overcome the problems of a standing army in peacetime? That's the first question. Second question, what can we learn from the founders' debates about the dangers of standing armies and about how those dangers were best met? Finally, are either of these arguments, the arguments of Huntington and Janowitz or the arguments of the founders, are either of these arguments still relevant? Why should we care about them now? Can they help us balance what is the current demands for military security and the liberty of citizens? So those are our three questions. Let's start with the first. The reasons for keeping a permanent military establishment after the Second World War were plain enough. They were broadcast in the headlines of newspapers. There was news about the Soviet expansion into Eastern Europe, the Soviet blockade of Berlin, the Soviet success at building an atom bomb, and the success of Mao's communist revolution in China. And if this were not enough, there was soon an invasion of South Korea by North Korea that led to a large police action that looked a lot like war. This was an unsettling post-war peace. It justified continued and extensive preparations for war. But if so, it also challenged what was held dear in American experience. We're talking about something that cuts more deeply than technical uncertainties about how to craft a response to present threats. On the scale required for the Cold War, this new military establishment violated a strong and long-held taboo. A taboo against keeping standing armies in peacetime. A taboo that lay close to the heart of American political culture. The fear was that standing armies might lead to tyranny. Put bluntly, a standing army might usurp power that properly belonged to civilian leaders. Or else, and this point is maybe more important, or else civilian rulers might use a standing army to pursue adventures of their own without the consent of the people. These worries were not simply imagined. They were deeply rooted in the hard experience of military and political conflict during the 18th century and before. The experience was vivid in the minds of those who fought in the American Revolution and then helped found the country. Nor was their experience quickly forgotten. Subjective memories of military abuse were turned into objective practices to prevent its recurrence. There was little or no tolerance for experiments to consider whether the supposed relationship between the standing army and tyranny was always true. This was not a time for hypothesis testing when the Republic was at stake. What was hoped from the founding through the 19th century was that in war, civilian leaders could raise big armies on the hope that big armies would represent, identify with, and respect the people. And then in peacetime, as we've said, let's dismantle that army as quickly as possible so tyranny will have no chance to grow. Nonetheless, at the end of the Second World War, all this changed. What had been taboo was now allowed. The country abandoned its well-worn protective practices, though with what effect at that time, no one knew. Now, more than 60 years later, I wonder whether people still think about the threats to civil-military relations posed by standing armies. For many, maybe most, keeping a large standing army is simply the way of life. It's the way life has always been. They might be puzzled by any suggestion that doing so, keeping a standing army, violated a long-held taboo. How could that be? How could any leading power suppose it was possible to live safely in this dangerous world without a standing army? But then, in the late 1940s, then it was different. In the late 1940s and through the 1950s, the effects of this radical departure from historical practice weighed on the mind. So Huntington and Janowitz and others wanted to think through how civil-military relations would be affected. Would they be weakened? Would they be strengthened? By founding a permanent military establishment to counter Cold War threats. And they felt a sense of urgency to do this quickly while there was still a chance to do something about it. As Janowitz wrote at the time, the military face a crisis as a profession. He didn't immediately identify what that crisis was, maddening, but he didn't. But what he thought at stake was the military's ability to meet its national security duties. Huntington wrote in a similar vein, but at greater length, observing that the military had abandoned the military had abandoned its professional military ethic since 1946, while it increased its political influence. The result, he thought, would reduce the military's ability to meet military security requirements as well as it might have done. Now, I don't wish to exaggerate. I don't want to make it seem as if Janowitz and Huntington agreed on their diagnosis of post-war problems in civil-military relations. They did not. Yet it's equally mistaken for us to ignore what they shared in common. And they shared at least two things in common, which I'll just mention briefly. One, they agreed that the military was a profession, as professionalism was defined conventionally by social scientists at the time. They also agreed that the post-World War decade threatened military professionalism in ways that, if uncorrected, would threaten national security and undermine military effectiveness. They were not worried that the military would stage a coup. They were not worried that the military would abandon its fundamental responsibilities to serve the state. The problems that they were concerned with were more subtle. They had to do with defining the military's proper place within a democratic society. There was uncertainty about what this proper place should be in the post-World War era. There was uncertainty about this weakened military professional ethic, this undermined military effectiveness. And that is why both sought to strengthen, to enhance the professional ethic. They wanted to clarify the military's proper place in a democracy engaged in a Cold War. Now, of course, they disagreed about how to do it. Huntington believed that the military profession would be virtuous if it lived up to the normative expectations that established what he called objective civilian control. As you already know, objective civilian control obtained when there was a clear distinction between what was military and what was civilian. The domains of the military and civil power, he thought, ought to be kept separate from one another. Separate from one another in theory, separate from one another in practice. In other words, the military profession was virtuous when it cultivated its particular expertise and only used it to pursue ends defined by the state. But should the military become distracted by, or should the military become entangled in political considerations, objective control over the military would degrade. Civilian control would become subjective. Expert knowledge would no longer be the guide for action, and military effectiveness would be impaired. That, Huntington thought, was precisely the problem the country faced when it created a permanent military establishment after the Second World War. It could not have been otherwise. To prevent this, some action was required. The professional military ethic could only be strengthened if there were a shift in political culture away from the liberal ideology that had for so long shaped American civil-military relations, away from this liberal ideology toward a conservative realism that was committed to establishing objective civilian control. Well, that's a gloss, leaving out a lot of details, which we can talk about later if you'd like. Let's look at what Janowitz argued. Janowitz understood the need for strengthening the professional military ethic in a radically different way. The question was the same. How could one sustain democratic control over the military? How could one sustain and preserve democratic values when the military had become a large, professional force in being. But an answer to that question, Janowitz thought, had to be couched in terms of new possibilities in the Second World War, post-Second World War era. New possibilities, not just possibilities, oh, forgive the theological tint, new temptations. Not just new possibilities, but temptations. First, there was the temptation for the permanent defense establishment to become politically active. The temptation was not to pose a direct military threat, it was rather for the military to act as a political pressure group, lobbying for its interests, the way any political pressure group would do. The historians among you are already saying, well, of course, the military has always been doing that. There's nothing new there. But the temptation, Janowitz thought, was more worrisome now in this new era with a standing army in peacetime. The temptation was greater now than it was before. And there's another thing. The military is not just a run-of-the-mill pressure group trying to influence government from the outside. By oath, military professionals are committed to serve the government. They're committed to do the government's bidding. They are not meant to determine the government's course. This distinction between serving government and determining government's course may never be perfectly clear. It's always difficult to observe. But with a permanent military establishment, the distinction was, if anything, less clear than it had been. And that made and makes it tempting for military professionals to stretch the boundaries that define what is appropriate. That's the first temptation. Here's the second. It was tempting for a continuously mobilized professional military to emphasize the worth of its distinctive values over the values of civilian society. This temptation increased after the Vietnam War, when the professional military moved from a draft base to an all-volunteer force. Service in the all-volunteer force was not grounded in a common obligation of citizenship. It was the outcome of self-selection, leading to a military that was socially distant from, not socially representative of, the population it served. Janowitz worried that if social distance between the military and the people increased, then civilian control of the military would become more difficult. Specifically, the moral contract between the military and the people would be frayed as social distance ate away at the foundations of trust and caring that are necessary to bond the military and the people together in a democratic society. Let me be clear so we don't misunderstand one another about this second temptation. The claims that I'm making are the claims of Janowitz's theory. I'm not asserting these as matters of fact. This theoretically is what Janowitz thought would happen if we had a large permanent military establishment in the post-World War era. We had to deal with that. Third temptation, and the one which the military hate most of all. Military professionals were tempted to become rigid and inflexible in the face of intractable limits put on the use of military force. Janowitz rejected the assumption that war in this era was inevitable. On the contrary, the evolving technology of war, epitomized by weapons of mass destruction, required a reconsideration of that assumption about the inevitability of war. International relations surely will be influenced by the threat and by the use of force, but opportunities for the effective use of force were radically limited, Janowitz thought, radically limited compared with opportunities for using force during the world wars and earlier. After the Second World War, a line was crossed, he thought. The underlying use of military weapons to fight and win the nation's wars could no longer be the military's calling. An unlimited use of force would be self-defeating. It would be a fool's errand. So war could no longer be a warrior's contest that a country either won or lost. Military victory was not the objective. The aim was a political one, to construct viable international relations relying on the minimum of force, ideally, at most, on a show of force. All this was a tall order for military professionals. To remain an effective expert force required hard training and continuous innovation. Yet this was a frustrating task, to train to do well what one hoped never to do, to ready the use of weapons of mass destruction, knowing their use cannot win a war. Such tasks made it difficult to grasp the meaning of the military profession. The temptation was for military professionals to become psychologically rigid, clinging to outmoded and traditional conceptions of the warrior's role. Perhaps these, at least, seemed to be meaningful, these traditional practices, even if they lacked perfect relevance in the Cold War era. Overcoming these temptations required a reconstruction of military virtue. How so? Janowitz's prescriptions were first to reconstruct military virtue so that it depended more on the needs of a unified force and less on the clash of political interests that characterize inter-service rivalry. Second, military service should not be a professional virtue isolated and disconnected from society, from the values of society. Rather, military service should find its place within the civic virtue of citizens, all citizens, according to Janowitz, all of whom ideally should answer the call for national service, whether in the military or by some other means. Finally, to control frustration arising from the limits on the use of force, the military professional ethic ought to be reinforced by a program of political education. The aim here was not to turn military into political actors. The aim is to clarify how the military profession meaningfully contributes to keeping peace and increasing security. To put what the military do day by day into a meaningful context, limiting frustration. There are other things that civilian leaders might do, but for Janowitz, an effective first response to the post-World War era begins with strengthening the professional military ethic to overcome the temptations posed by a standing army in peacetime. Now, the differences between these two alternative proposals, these differences between Huntington on the one hand and Janowitz on the other, these two alternate proposals for enhancing the professional military ethic, these two proposals are real and merit our examination, but not today. We're not going to dwell on the differences that separate them. What is striking to us at present, rather, is their common assumption. Both believed that fears about creating a permanent military establishment after the Second World War could be put aside if there was a reconstruction of military virtue. That is an extraordinary claim. Was it warranted? Well, I'm going to put that question aside for the moment. We have, I think, first to turn to our second question, to see what it was that the founders had to say about the dangers of a standing army in peacetime, to see how they thought these problems could be defined and overcome. For the founders, strengthening the military's professional ethic was not what mattered most to address the danger of standing armies. Instead of the virtue of military officers, they cared about the division of war powers. They wanted to know how war powers were going to be divided among various offices, and so how these divisions of powers might create a republic strong enough to quell foreign threats and domestic disturbances, but not so strong as to quash their liberty. Institutional practices were needed to do this, to find, as Hamilton put it, that happy mean between the government's power and the citizens' privilege. Direct and recent experience with the standing armies of George III instructed them on this point. While there was disagreement among them on what protections were required, inspection of the debates among the founders on whether to adopt the Constitution reveals no disagreement among them that standing armies in peacetime posed real dangers to a republic and that substantial protections were called for to meet the dangers head on. There was no disagreement among the Federalists and Anti-Federalists on this point. Whether there was really no disagreement in their hearts of hearts, we'll never know. But the political context was such that no politician in the era who wished to keep a job or get elected could say anything other than that standing armies in peacetime were a danger to the Republic. What were the dangers? The dangers were of two kinds. First, standing armies tended to undermine the constitutional structure of Republican government. They moved from the constitutional structure of a republic to a constitutional organization of aristocracy or monarchy. That wasn't what they wanted. That's not what they wanted to embrace. That was the very thing they were hoping to prevent. Still, the outcome was hard to avoid. States had no choice but to form standing armies in peacetime that were powerful enough to meet threats posed by foreign enemies and to settle domestic disturbances. You might say, well, we have to limit that force. They weren't fools. They looked at that possibility. How could we limit that force? But attempts to limit provisions for self-defense aren't easily manufactured. They might readily fail, as James Madison noted. They might fail either because the limits made the state vulnerable to defeat, forging the chains of monarchy, or they might fail because the limits would be ignored, as the people responded more to their desire for safety than they did for their desire for liberty. The impulse of self-preservation was key. But if you went to the other side and said, okay, we won't restrict it at all, there won't be any limits on force, then the strength of standing armies posed risks for the Republic again. Why? Because, as Hamilton observed, when states prepare for war, when states build standing armies, they strengthen the executive arm of the government. It is the nature of war, Hamilton wrote, and by extension of preparations for war. It is the nature of war to increase the executive at the expense of the legislative authority. Under this circumstance, even Republican states progress toward a monarchy. In short, neither limited nor unlimited measures for self-defense offer safety for a Republican government. As Madison concludes, a standing force, therefore, is dangerous at the same time that it is necessary. The other danger from standing armies in peacetime is the danger they may do to the moral psychology of Republican citizens. When threats of invasion are high and chronic, requiring standing armies in peacetime, the people may be broken by subordination to military power. As the military is elevated above civilians, the people come to see soldiers as superior to themselves. They lose their sense of having civil and political rights. This opens the door, the founders thought, to military oppression. It permits the rule of law to be relaxed in order to meet military exigencies. Seeking security, the people become willing to run the risk of being less free. Their willingness to resist usurpations of military power grows weak. In short, the importance of soldiers in society is enhanced, while the condition of citizens is degraded. These dangers that the founders saw were not easy to defeat. But if they were not defeated, how was it possible to maintain a powerful republic and keep citizens' liberties intact? The Federalists thought it could be done in three ways. First, they would limit the threats to war that made it necessary to keep standing armies in peacetime. There was no denying the existence of threats from Native Americans and from the presence of European powers. Still, overall, the country's situation was more like that of Britain. More like that of Britain than like that of the continental powers in war-torn Europe. So the Federalists argued that the country could enjoy the benefits of being an insular nation like Britain, and so avoid the need for a large standing army. Second, they thought war could be avoided and the need for standing armies reduced if states were united under the Constitution. This was the Federalists' favorite argument, of course. But if the states weren't united, then all bets were off. If the states were disunited, then wars among North American states would be as common as wars were in Europe, and that would require every state to maintain a large standing army. It would be the end of the republics. But if they were united under a national government, a strong national government, the states would deter European powers from invading the country, and they would not live at war amongst one another. Third point. The founders would protect liberty by dividing the war powers of government, so their exercise would depend as far as possible on the representatives of the people, and on the states. If war powers were in the hands of the people, if war powers were kept local, then the dangers from a standing army were reduced. So in writing the Constitution, the founders' task was to walk a tightrope. They had to create a powerful national government while at the same time limiting its powers limiting its war powers to protect the rights of states and citizens. Well, how were the powers divided? Oh, I'm at a crossroads here, a turning point of my own. I have a longish paragraph detailing the divisions of war powers in the Constitution, which I'm really loath to read to you, as you probably already are familiar with them. The key features for us are that it was to Congress that had the power to initiate war. I'm not talking about self-defense, but the initiation of war. Congress had the power over military appropriations, which could be no longer than 2 years. The president was the commander-in-chief, a phrase very vague, allowing, as we've seen over time, a rapid expansion, a substantial expansion of the role. Yet it's also worth noticing that by making president commander-in-chief, the military is, in the last analysis, always subordinate to a civilian and to civilian power. And finally, the control over state militias was divided between the state governments and the federal government. The Congress was supposed to create a discipline, regulations for the state militia, and to arm it. The states, meanwhile, retained the ability to name their own officers and to implement the training regiment. Well, that's not enough to say, but it's enough to remind us of what we should say if we were going to read the whole Constitution together now. The anti-federalists were livid at these distributions of war powers. They hated it. They were alarmed by the allocation of war powers to the national government. They doubted it offered strong safeguards against the dangers of a standing army. They worried that the power of Congress to raise an army was unlimited and contained no provision against raising armies in peacetime. They worried that military appropriations were for 2 years, which seemed too long to them. In Britain, Parliament's military appropriation had to be approved every year. Now we're going to double that period to 2 years. They worried They worried that the strength of state militias, which were supposed to be a powerful check against federal armies, that the strength of state militias was not adequately provided for. The militia depended on Congress to supply it and to arm it. But what would prevent Congress from failing to do either one, to provide the supplies, to provide the arms, thereby allowing the militia to languish? Alternatively, they worried that the president may use militia forces called into federal service as a kind of standing army of his own, and thus strengthen the military power of the national government over the states. The worries recognized that compared with the national government under the Articles of Confederation, the national government under the Constitution was powerful, and so seemed a threat to their liberty. The Federalists took these arguments seriously. They had no other choice if they wanted to secure ratification of the Constitution. They tried to argue why the Anti-Federalist fears were misplaced. For instance, they reminded the Anti-Federalists that virtually every state constitution, by states now I mean the 13 states, every state constitution placed no limits on the legislature to raise an army. They argued that state militias under federal discipline would be more effective than if each military had a discipline of its own, and so as the militia was more effective, the need for a standing force was reduced. And they scolded the Anti-Federalists who thought that limiting military appropriations to 2 years was a relatively weak restraint because Britain's appropriations had to be approved every year. That missed the key point, the Federalists argued. The restraint on Congress was a constitutional restraint. So it was hard to change. A British parliamentary practice to authorize military appropriations every year could be changed in the blink of an eye. Well, despite these and other arguments, as you well know, the Federalists were not entirely persuasive. Yes, the Constitution was ratified, but the ratification was made contingent on passage of amendments to provide for a Bill of Rights. 2 amendments in particular addressed the question of the standing army. One was the Second Amendment. This amendment affirms that the people's right to keep and bear arms is essential, an essential liberty which government can't transgress. Bearing arms is an important political right connected with the idea that people are sovereign and have the right forcibly to topple a government that becomes a tyranny. The Federalists, Hamilton and Madison, both argued that the militia could do that. With the Constitution as written, the militia was strong enough to overcome any tyrannical power in the country. What the Second Amendment does is precludes any attempt by Congress to abuse its powers by disarming the militia. The Second Amendment in the Bill of Rights dealing with standing armies is the Third Amendment. This amendment forbade the government from quartering troops in any house in peacetime without the consent of the owner or in war as prescribed by law. Quartering troops without the owner's consent or without the authority of law was an offensive practice, a practice associated with the standing armies of James II before the Glorious Revolution, an offensive practice associated with George III, not very far from here in fact, before the American Revolution. It was an insidious form of occupation. The Third Amendment barred the practice. It secured the privileges of citizens. Citizens could not, without their consent, see their property conscripted by the government for use by a standing army in peacetime. Even during war, conscription required the rule of law. Together, these amendments provided additional structural or institutional barriers to overcome the dangers to liberty posed by a standing army, while yet leaving the country with an adequate self-defense. In sum, the founders never thought to balance the power of government and the liberties of citizens by relying on the virtue of American citizens or the virtue of their leaders. They certainly did not believe defeating the dangers of a standing army depended on the virtues of those who served in the standing armed force. Indeed, they entrusted this task of protection, to the basic structure of constitutional law. Well, these are old problems, but they are not dusty. Let's think to what degree are these positions we've been talking about, to what degree they're relevant to us at the moment. Although the Cold War ended over 20 years ago, a large military establishment is still required. So it remains relevant to ask how we might balance the need for security against the need to maintain the rights and liberties of citizens. Indeed, in this age of terror, the question could hardly be more relevant. What about the answers posed by Huntington and Janowitz? What about the answers offered by the founders? Are they still relevant? Do they offer advice worth taking? At first glance, the approach taken by Huntington and Janowitz to strengthen the professional ethic seems much too narrow to be of help in our time. While Huntington and Janowitz recognized the tension between power and liberty, neither examined the tension in any depth. Both focused instead on the professional military ethic. They did so because they believed a strong professional ethic would maintain and improve military effectiveness. In other words, they were most concerned about how to increase government power. They did not ask how increasing military effectiveness might affect individual liberty, whether to enhance it or curtail it. Whether we prefer the arguments of Huntington or Janowitz in our civil military thinking in general, we have to admit in this case that neither offers much, if any, guidance about how to find that happy mean between power and privilege. The approach of the founders seems more apt to deal with the current situation. The founders recognized that they could not totally control whether to keep a standing army in peacetime. That depended on what threats emerged. They couldn't determine how large such a force would be. That depended on the threats that emerged. What was needed depended on the threats the nation faced. As the threats grew large, the pressure to increase the army would also grow. And as the army grew, the founders were quick to say, government power increased, and that in turn increased the dangers to a Republican government. They did not have their heads in the sand. They recognized that increasing threats had consequences for the balance between power and privilege. Under these conditions, the founders' first idea was to reduce the threat as far as possible. They tried to do this. They hoped it could be done if the country could remain an insular force rather than a continental force. But that hope for us is not available. There are no more insular powers. The country is more vulnerable to large attack and needs greater powers than it needed at the time of the founding. This highlights, however, the relevance of the founders. I know that's counterintuitive, but nevertheless it's true. Standing armies, the founders taught, are more dangerous as they become more necessary. And that's the situation in which we find ourselves. This is not to say that the founders' analysis of the problems that we face were perfect. The analysis was not perfect. One danger they expected was with the erosion of Republican citizenship. They thought citizens would be cowed by and become subservient to military power. This expectation does not seem especially relevant today. While some scholars claim to see a decline in civic virtue, the evidence that they offer for this decline isn't strong. Their complaints describe and decry what they call rampant individualism, but they offer little or no evidence to suggest that citizens are increasingly subservient to military or political power. More relevant is the founders' other expectation that persistent threats of war undermined Republican constitutions because the legislature's war powers were to be taken over by the executive branch. Here is where I may regret not reading the Constitution, chapter and verse. The substantial war powers allocated to the Congress. And over time, the argument would be, the Federalist argument would be, the Founders' argument would be that over time, under the conditions in which we find ourselves, this Republican Constitution would is that my phone? Could that be? No. Whew. I feel so much better. So where was I? Okay, so the founders were worried that under pressure of a standing army of peacetime, we would see a transformation of the Constitution away from a Republican Constitution toward some Constitution in which power was concentrated, not a monarchy anymore, not an aristocracy anymore. The key point is that the legislature loses power relative to the executive branch. This concentration of power threatened liberty. The separation of war powers was necessary to protect the rights and liberties of citizens. Without these checks and balances, liberty was in peril. The balance between power and privilege tilted in favor of power. That's the issue that the founders saw that seems relevant today. That's what the founders taught us, and so it seems to be. Without doubt, presidential war powers have expanded over many years, well beyond anything that founders might have imagined or found compatible with their understanding of a Republican government. Alongside this expansion has been a complementary trend in which exercise of congressional war powers, meant to be extensive, has become weak and ineffectual. A clear illustration of these developments, not the only one to be sure, but a clear illustration of these developments is found in the history of the War Powers Resolution, which Congress passed in 1973 over the veto of President Richard Nixon. That resolution was a vain attempt by Congress to regain its exclusive power to initiate military operations. No president from either party has accepted the constitutionality of the resolution. Even those who are supportive of the resolution's aims criticize the resolution for imposing an ineffective, even an incoherent restraint on the president's power to begin military conflicts. So there has been a major shift in the making, evident since 1946, some would say evident before. It is a shift away from congressional to presidential control over the fundamental decision whether to send the country to war. It is hard to know whether this shift is permanent. No doubt the expansion was not inevitable. But it is hard now to imagine conditions under which Congress could reclaim the war powers it exerted more vigorously in earlier years. At this point, advice from the founders falters. The founders help us identify the problem, but they have no clear idea about how that problem might be solved in our time. That is a matter for the present generation. The age of terror has hastened the shift from legislative to executive war powers and raised hard questions about how to respect the need for security and liberty. Controversies are far from resolved about the power of presidents to designate and detain enemy combatants, about the power of presidents to deny detainees access to legal counsel and other legal protections, or the power of presidents to authorize torture, sometimes called by other names, as a means of enhanced interrogation. These controversies indicate how unsure we are about where is the happy mean between the sovereign powers of government and the warrants of rights and liberties. In a recent opinion by the United States Court of Appeals, The court held that the president's power to detain those suspected of terrorism was virtually unlimited. Virtually unlimited even by the laws of war. As put by Judge Janice Rogers Brown, quote, "War is a challenge to law, and the law needs to adjust," end quote. On this account, nothing matters except power. On this account, the aims of the founders to balance liberty and power, those aims no longer apply. Of course, Judge Brown's word is not the final word. The controversies still rage, and the future is open. Like the founders in their day, and like the generation that followed the Second World War, now this generation stands at a turning point. Confronting problems posed by an age of terror, can this generation create new ways to provide for power and also to promote liberty? Can this generation do that? We will see. Meanwhile, ironically, now may be a good time to recall and to follow the advice we got from Huntington and Janowitz, who I've just previously thrown into the dustbin of history. Maybe we do need to strengthen the professional military ethic. I don't mean it's time for us slavishly to follow either Huntington or Janowitz. I don't think that would be appropriate in the least. What I mean is strengthening the professional military ethic is now an important task for us to do, precisely because we are in this age of terror where we have to reconstruct the law about balancing liberty and power. When there is deep uncertainty about what law requires, then, I think, we are more than ever in need to know what commitments define military professionalism. We must say what limits the conduct of military professionals and tell why these limits deserve our respect. This will not solve every problem, but it may help keep our problems from growing worse. Thank you.
One of the reasons I thought it was really important for Jim to give this talk is it's become a growing perception of mine that we as a culture have sort of lost a bit of our collective memory regarding our Constitution and the issues of the founding. So I've asked Jim very much to give us this long historical view. I think, however, it was pretty clear at the end that the issues that the founders were most worried about are not only alive and well, but perhaps growing increasingly. Let me, Mary Beth, go ahead, start us off. This is Dr. Mary Beth Ulrich from the Army War College.
Steal too much of my thunder, but when I was doing the next talk, which deals with a lot of the same issues, I was wondering when you're thinking about the standing army in the post-war World War II era, if you thought about the difference has made that we have stuck, in the middle of that period is the advent of the all-volunteer force. So what difference does that make? Now that we're in this era of, it seems like there's no turning back on to this mass participation in the standing army, and that seems to be a very important factor. And I know you have thoughts about this that just weren't addressed.
So, the movement from a standing armed force based on conscription to a standing armed force based on the volunteer force is just part of a continuum. Now, it's certainly, an all-volunteer force isn't incompatible, say, with what was happening in the 19th century or in the late 18th century, but here I think we see a further step toward the professionalization of the permanent defense establishment. And I don't see any occasion, any reason why we can expect that to stop. That's just part of the problem now. It's a refinement of the problem. I don't see it as something qualitatively new, so much as I see it as a further increment in the development of the permanent defense establishment. Now, I'm not against a permanent defense establishment. I hope I've made that clear enough. The threats we face are genuine, and we have to have a military strong enough to meet them. To do so is, well, imprudent. What I find interesting is that in this post-World War era, we seem to have put aside our concern with balance, which was what occupied the founders so much. And that's a question I'd love to hear you talk about. What is this balance between power on the one hand and liberty on the other? Power adequate to defend ourselves, and liberty strong enough so that we deserve the name of Republicans, little r, Republicans. You can be big R Republicans too if you want, but little r Republicans. Do we deserve that? Why did the discourse of liberty just sort of drop out of view in a theory of civil-military relations? How did that happen? I'd like to know more about that. I've only begun to scratch the surface in this paper.
Important point that came out of the Janowitz sort of era that you didn't touch on, which was the assurance that the officer corps would be absolutely apolitical. And by any current measure, our officer corps is extremely political and extremely politically vocal. One important assurance was we could make do with a big standing force because it would be so utterly outside our political system. You really didn't touch on that, so I wonder if I could force you to go there a little bit.
Yeah, you can. You may not know, maybe you do know. If we were to count words, I probably said more about Janowitz and Huntington. If I had to be one or the other, I'd be a Janowitzian. So to your question, Martin, my answer has to be sort of ambivalent. On the one hand, I think Janowitz did recognize that there would be a politicization of the military right away when he started talking about, and he devotes several chapters to the problem of the military being a political pressure group. That language sounds really old-fashioned to us today. But in the 50s and early 60s, it was current. And it had some zip and pack to it. We thought if we could just study pressure groups, we could understand democratic theory so much better. Whether that's true or not, I don't know, but at least he saw the possibility for political conflict opening up in that era through the enhancement of the lobbying efforts of a permanent defense establishment, and he thought that lobbying would be worse. Is that me or you? People have their guns out? That would be worse if we maintain the same level of well, he wanted a unified armed force. He wanted to limit inter-service rivalries, and he wanted to limit the extent to which inter-service rivalries prevented a variety of lobbying within Congress, both by active duty forces and between active duty forces and reserve forces. So that's one thing. He did, I think, consider the political dimension. But you're right. He was an idealist in ways that we no longer can be. When he thought about the problem of when he talked about the frustration of the military profession and the meaning of the profession, I think there are real conflicts that we have about that, which are much more focused, much less Freudian. We need to know more about that, and Janowitz was just at the periphery. He didn't really believe this was ever going to be. He believed that we needed to deal with the frustration, but he didn't believe it was going to be a political problem. You and I agree that there is a political problem there. And I'll just mention one thing. Maybe some of you saw it. I was watching the State of the Union last week, I guess it was, and the response by the governor from Virginia, very eloquent response. Who was that staff sergeant sitting behind him, cheering, in uniform? Who was that guy? And worse, why did nobody bring it up? Why didn't somebody on Fox News or CNN or something, so well, you named the channel of your, I suppose it wouldn't be Nick at Night, but why didn't somebody bring it up?
The one important figure of the period, the early Cold War period that you did mention, to my surprise, was President Eisenhower and his farewell address. which warns of the dangers of this growing military-industrial complex.
He sort of drew on C. Wright Mills. Janet would thought Mills was a nut.
Seriously, some questions from students, please. Yes, sir. Well, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Professor. Thanks for coming.
My pleasure. I'm happy to be here.
My microphone doesn't work, so I'll just stand up.
Okay.
You've given us a good historical overview, but let's put the who in it. What do you think? Are we in danger? I mean, your points resonate. The more we need a military, the more dangerous it becomes. You can look at certain countries, the Turks, for example. Again, I'm not an expert, but
Good. Neither am I. We can talk forever.
whenever the government goes too far left or too far in one direction, the military will step in and bring them
Right.
back to where they think the center should be. Do you actually think there's a danger of that? I would suggest in the United States, it's not the fact that there would be a military push, but the fact that the entire military equals money. Money equals representatives in districts everywhere. Representatives want money because they want to maintain their jobs, they want to get jobs for their folks. So I would say it's much more insidious than a military general, say, in marching on Washington. It's a process in small accretions over time that kind of erodes this thought of virtue and becomes one of something else entirely. So let me go back to the beginning. What do you think?
Well, like you, I don't expect a Turkish political culture to be transplanted into the United States. So I don't expect, I would be horrified by a prospect such as you describe occurs there. And I don't expect that. If I would do anything, I would shift the debate away from the military and focus more on the presidency, and by which I don't mean this president or that president, I mean the executive branch per se. How does the executive branch exercise its war powers in a way that is respectful to the liberties of its citizens and responsive to the needs of its military? That's the trend line I think we should be examining. In civil-military relations theory, we've worked so hard and so long to try to say what is civilian control over the military and how is it maintained. But it's like we're missing the elephant in the room, at least in terms of the issue of civil-military relations in American society. I think the founders had it quite right. The recurrent question for us is how to balance the demands for security and liberty. And if we focus on how that balance has changed over the last 50, 60 years, it seems to me that balance has been shifted by a diminution of Congress's responsibility for its war powers and an enhancement of the executive branch of its war powers. Now, I want to be clear, this to me is a structural issue. It's not a question of demonizing or villainizing anybody. This, I think, has been what the pressures of the structural development, of the constitutional framework of the country have been. What do I think should happen? Well, I think we should study that executive branch business more deeply, but I think the harder problem is to figure out how you get Congress to live up to its exercise of its war powers. That's really intractable. The presidency is a cinch compared to that, and I haven't a clue how to solve the problem with the presidency, the executive branch. It's really hard to think through that, but I think it's important to think it through. I think it's important to insist to Congress, as President Ford tried to do, make Congress take responsibility when the Constitution gives it that responsibility. But when Congress doesn't do it and action needs to be taken, what is a president supposed to do? Well, Ford acted, and I can't blame him for that, though my preference might have been, in an ideal world, for some different outcome.
I see Jim has a question, but if there are students who do, I'd give them preference order. Okay, Jim, go ahead.
So Jim Ellsworth, I'm on the faculty here. I think you've raised a lot of key points, and am particularly interested in this context in the lessons of the importance of a strengthened military ethic as a counterweight or as an additional layer of defense, if you will. But I think that I'm less concerned than you are about the loss of balance because of the one branch that you didn't mention much, which as a constitutional scholar sort of makes sense, and that's the growing power of the judicial branch as striking that balance. Part of the reason the War Powers Resolution hasn't been challenged is because Congress is just as concerned that the Supreme Court will find in favor of the executive branch in the dispute as they are the legislative. And I was wondering if you could address more how you see the strength and role of the judicial branch in helping us to strike the balance you seek.
Well, I don't think anybody should fear the Supreme Court striking down the War Powers Resolution. I think more to be concerned with would be if they upheld it as it presently is written, because it really is logically incoherent and provides no real restraint. It's really bad law in my unprofessional view. I'm not a lawyer, and maybe some of you are, and I'm practicing law without a license. Who knows what will happen next? That to me is not an issue. The role of the judiciary in the exercise of war powers is very, as you know, is a very ticklish question. And I think it's very hard to know at this point what the court doctrine would be about that. Maybe I'll learn more about that this week. I certainly hope so. So for instance, we have the Rehnquist doctrine with respect to the judiciary and war powers, which essentially says, it's your guys' problem, we're going to stay out of it. Whatever you like, we're good. And there are times when I find Rehnquist's deference to the military to be annoying. But that's usually when they decide something I don't like. And the fact of the matter is, I think that the judiciary is wise not to get involved overly much in military matters, certainly not in the conduct of war. But then we have this darn war on terror, and we have these detainees, and we have well, I prefer plain speaking. We authorize the torturing of people against the laws of the country, against international treaties that we have signed. What's up with that? If the judiciary doesn't stop to put some limits on that, at some point, well then, that is a slippery slope down which I hope not to go. So I'm hoping Judge Brown's views will be tempered. Now I know she speaks in a great legal tradition. Oliver Wendell Holmes was one who would say, law is whatever power says it is. And maybe Brown had Oliver Wendell Holmes in mind when she wrote what she wrote. But when our problem seems to be uncertainty about how to use law to govern the country in a way to maintain the balance between security and liberty, when that is our particular problem, her decision to me is like sort of somebody pouring salt in the wound. It's not a helpful way out. So in the end, I'm looking for, particularly with respect to civil rights issues, I'm hoping the court will become or remain active. But with respect to military discipline and the conduct of war, the political questions doctrine seems good to me.
Sir.
I'm Joe Fahmy from class of 74, 75. Stood here in one of the first ethics conferences. I think we're talking now about cross-cultural ethics, because we write laws in our country, as Brown did, within the context of our Judeo-Christian, natural law, Judeo-Christian, Bible kind of ethical base. We're dealing with Islam, which has an entirely different ethical base. Their rules of engagement are completely outside of the norm of our thinking. So how do we give them equal access to our benefits of law when they don't, would never reciprocate with theirs?
Right. Well, you raise a hard question, and you know it, and I thank you for it. When I think about strengthening the military professional ethic, what I mean is we need to become more explicit about what values, what principles we think are worth standing up for and dying for in the end. And that's going to be a hard debate, which we have to have. Whether we will have it or not, I don't know. Politics is, thrives on evasion and compromise, not on the resolution of principled arguments. But if we want to know what is the professional military ethic, we need to know what principles stand behind it. We take an oath to the Constitution. And in a way that suggests that whatever the military professional is beholden to a higher law. That law is the Constitution. Of course, the Constitution is written in an 18th century prose with specifics which may not seem directly applicable to a war on terror like you're talking about today, posing the problems that you're talking about today. But behind the Constitution is a sense of law. There are assumptions in the Constitution, and many of those assumptions have to do with our government being committed to maintaining humanitarian principles. Where did I get that phrase? You may not know. This is the Naval War College, right? But the phrase comes from General Hartle, his wonderful book on moral decision-making in the military.
Which, by the way, they all have a copy of.
Oh, good. So he talks in that work, as you know, about two humanitarian principles that underwrite the military ethic, military's professional ethic. If adhering to those principles causes a problem for us, if it doesn't allow for us to do what is militarily exigent, then I would say we should follow the principles. I'm no expert in Islam, so there's limits on how far I can go in this discussion, and I'm not going to claim expertise beyond. Well, I probably have already strained my claims for expertise. What I was trying to do in my first response was to cast my lot with Western civilization and its culture, its moral culture. I cast my lot with that. I'll sink or swim with that. And I'm unwilling to adopt other kinds of practices which are radically opposed to this. It's not worth it to me. Now, that's my personal response. I can't be more open with you than that.
Dr. Burk, Lieutenant Christian Beisel, United States Navy. How would you compare the increased use of contractors to the concerns over a large standing army in your balance of liberties and safety?
Yeah.
How would that relate to the increasing virtue within that standing military?
Right. Boy, I'm no big fan of private military companies. I've read a couple books on the matter. It looks really complicated. I need to study it. I haven't. I don't have a good answer to your question. Do you? Do you? Really? I'm serious. Have you studied the matter? What do you think? What do you think? Do you think we should ban the use of private military companies? Do you think we should expand the use of them?
I think there's concern over whether or not there are professional organizations
Right, increasing concerns. It seems almost every day we find some other problem. If there are going to be private military companies for handling the peeling of potatoes or something, well, I could get all behind that. But but it's a very, it's hard to know where to draw the line between simple logistics provisioning and actual military type operations, which depend to a large extent on the virtue of the soldier and of the sailor. And I think it matters that members of our military force are and see themselves as military professionals operating under an ethical system, that alters the way they walk around the world and use the force they have to manage in ways that cannot so easily be done with private military contractors. And I think our experience with them over the last 10 years will bear that out, although I presently don't have the evidence to prove the point.
All right, let's take a break until 10. You have a question there, sir?
Yes, sir.
I'm not.
Good morning,
wait
sir.
a minute.
Lieutenant Commander Lee Totten, United States Navy. The question I have regarding the question as to why can't we go back?
Why can't we go back?
Yes, sir. You mentioned about the founding fathers and their fears that they expressed. Is it because of the fact that the organization is so big, the proverbial genie is out of the bottle, capable of going back?
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that?
Okay, good question. As I was thinking about my remarks for today, it seemed to me that there were two things which Janowitz and Huntington and the founders did. They offered a diagnosis of the situation, and they offered a prescription. I think the founders were actually pretty good in their diagnosis, even for today. Not perfect, but pretty good. The question is, does their prescription apply? And there I have real doubts, and I didn't hit that explicitly or as hard as I might have done in my formal presentation. Their prescription was to do the things that we talked about when we skipped over reading the Constitution. Their allocation of war powers was their principal prescription for maintaining the balance between a strong government force and respecting the rights and liberties of citizens. And it's precisely those constitutional provisions which have weakened over time, in particular having to do with the presidential war powers. And you can see evidence of it in little things. You can see it in big things, and we talked about some of the big things already, but you can see it also in little things, like the State Department needing to have a greater capacity to engage in civil reconstruction. How is that going to be funded? Well, Congress can't get its act together to fund it. So what does the Department of Defense do? It doesn't lend, it gives the State Department money out of its budget to increase its capacity for civil reconstruction. I think it's a good thing to increase that capacity. But what does it mean when the State Department has to get its funding from the Department of Defense? That's a kind of curious arrangement. Who's in charge? There are all these murky arrangements at the fringes of the war powers, allocation of war powers in the Constitution at present. And the founders can't solve that problem. You should say, well, what should you do? They'd say, do what we wrote. And we say, well, we can't do that anymore. Well, then it's your problem. And I think they're right. It's our problem. It's up to us to reinvent those institutional structures which will contain abuses of power, should abuses occur, without weakening the strength of the country. It's hard. And I wish I had the prescription. I'm counting on you young people to do that. I'm here to encourage you.
These weren't used when I was in. Bring up the subject of hired hands, sir. Concerns me because I wondered if we were going to talk in and all about this bringing in volunteer force. I got a funny feeling that a lot of these things would be solved if some of the people had to get up in the morning when they're drinking their coffee and wondering whether their son or daughter, how is he doing on that patrol of the mountains this morning. It really bothers me. So few people have any investment in what's going on. So I'm just wondering, maybe it's time to talk about this volunteer force, so-called volunteer force. And so more people become concerned about what's happening. My message.
Do you want me to comment?
Yes, sure.
Spoken like a true Janowitzian. Janowitz, of course, thought it was essential, just as you think it's essential, that citizens of this country serve the country, that such an experience was important to maintain the civic virtue of citizens, and it was important for the well-being of the community. There is nothing that replaces it. Whether or not we can say, okay, that's really important, so now let's get rid of the all-volunteer force and reinstitute the draft, that's a different and a political question, and you already know that at least for the foreseeable future, that's not going to happen. Should it? I'm not sure. The conscript force after the Second World War was not much of a conscript force if what you were looking for from it was universal military service. It did provide some of that through the Korean War, police action, but not after that. In fact, once General Hershey got into the business of channeling people into one profession or the other, using the draft to allocate people to different occupations, well, its whole logic went away. But to say that answers with history, but it stays away from the core issue. The core issue is what kind of freedoms and liberties do we care about? No doubt many of you have read Isaiah Berlin's famous essays on liberty, and you know the difference between positive liberty and negative liberty. And now we know everything there is to know about liberty. Berlin, after all, is such an excellent writer. Who could read him and come away unpersuaded? This is one we can just put in the drawer. We've solved this problem, unlike the problems we were dealing with earlier. But you know, Berlin doesn't have the last word here. There's another interesting way of thinking about liberty and what liberty is that could be useful for the concern that you are raising. This is a typology that comes from a sociologist, Orlando Patterson, teaches up the road at Harvard. He said that there are three kinds of freedom, really. There's sovereignal freedom, which is my freedom to hit you on the head and steal your wallet, and as long as you're smaller than me and I can get away with it, well, I've got power, I've got freedom, and I've got your credit cards. That's one kind. A second kind is personal freedom. This is the freedom that says when I get up on a Saturday morning, I can do watercoloring if I want. I can listen to music. I can go see Avatar with my wife. I can eat as much popcorn as I want. This is what some criticize as the rampant individualism of modern society. But there's something to it. It's also the kind of liberty that John Stuart Mill is writing about when he writes about liberty. There's more to life than just politics. There's more to life than getting ready for war. There's lots to life. I like to play with my grandchildren on the ground, knees scuffed. Of course, they're better at it than I am, but I stay with them as long as I can, the full minute and a half. Then there is a third freedom, and that is civic freedom, which is the freedom of citizens to take responsibility for and care for the political communities of which they're a part. Among the balancing acts we need to perform is a balancing act that minimizes resort to sovereign power in our political community and leaves room for both civic freedom and personal freedom. That's, I think, part of a larger issue. You define a wonderful context within which our discussion can take place this week, I think. And we would be wise if we get lost in the thicket of our ideas, if we were to return to your question and think how it would affect the liberties we have in terms of sovereign freedom, civic freedom, and personal freedom? Wonderful question. Thank you.